You cross the finish line of a major project, land a new job, or finally get your bank account to a healthy baseline, and immediately a subtle psychological shift happens. You decide you've done enough. Because you've achieved a level of stability, you start grading yourself on a curve. You allow a few bad habits to stick around, skipping a workout, cutting a corner at work, because you're secure, and you tell yourself you have these small flaws completely under control. This exact instinct, trading total commitment for comfortable complacency, drives the opening chapter of the Book of Judges. It's the period right after the death of Joshua, and the tribes of Israel are left to finish securing their territory. At first, the campaign is flawless. The tribe of Judah pushes up into the steep, mountainous regions, easily securing the high ground. But then, right at the height of this momentum, the winning streak abruptly stops. They make a highly calculated, seemingly intelligent choice that sets the stage for a total national collapse. The problem starts with the geography. You can see in this view over the stone walls how the terrain changes. When the fighters of Judah descend into the plains, they find themselves in a vulnerable position. Down in the valleys, the Canaanites possess the ultimate area denial weapon, iron chariots. Instead of fighting, Judah halts. They don't retreat, but they don't drive the inhabitants out either. They pivot. They decide to let the Canaanites stay, forcing them into hard labor. On paper, this is a masterclass. You avoid a high-casualty battle against heavily armored vehicles and instantly acquire a massive workforce to build your new nation. It looks like a win-win. This highly pragmatic choice created a new reality. The nation was now physically and economically tethered to the very culture they were meant to replace. Judah had just cleared the mountains, proving that terrain and fortifications couldn't stop them. The chariots on the plains were a different technical challenge, but they revealed a limit in the Israelites' resolve. The iron was real, but the decision to stop was driven by the internal fear of the soldiers, not the external power of the enemy. In this context, failure looks like a checklist that's only 90% complete. We often think of wrongdoing as a series of malicious acts, but here it takes the form of incomplete obedience, stopping when the path becomes inconvenient. They suffered the illusion of control, assuming they could domesticate an unconquered threat, put it in a box and extract benefits. But spiritual decay is unforgiving. Tolerate a foreign element and combat effectiveness plummets. The compromise breaks out. If you choose to manage a flaw instead of removing it, the power dynamic eventually flips. The nature of that compromise dictates that it will grow to enslave its master. Once Judah, the leading tribe, rationalized this halfway measure, the rest of the historical record in Judges chapter 1 becomes a cascade of identical failures. The tribe of Benjamin follows suit, failing to drive out the Jebusites. Manasseh moves in, looks at the inhabitants, and decides to let them stay. Then Ephraim does the exact same thing. A single localized compromise splinters into a systemic national collapse. Reading through verses 21 to 36 is suffocating. The phrase, "did not drive out," repeats like a broken metronome. Spiritual failure simply becomes the standard operating procedure. History proves the rule. The adversaries you refuse to expel when you have the chance are the adversaries you will be forced to live with permanently. To see how abnormal this failure was, we only have to look at another fighter from the exact same era, a veteran named Caleb. At 85 years old, Caleb looks at Hebron. As you can see in this view of similar terrain, Hebron is a dense, heavily fortified stronghold built into the steep rocky hills, and Caleb completely conquers it. Caleb and the younger tribes possessed the exact same military capabilities. The difference was visual focus. Caleb looked at an impossible mountain, but his eyes were entirely fixed on the promise God had made to him. The younger generation looked at a flat plain, but their eyes were entirely fixed on the iron chariots. An army's success against insurmountable odds depends on its anchor. Caleb looked at the promise. The tribes looked at the iron. So what are the iron chariots in your own life? What is the intimidating force making you halt your progress? It might be financial pressure, the fear of losing social standing, or just a deep anxiety about an unknown future. And more importantly, where are the unconquered corners you've quietly decided to keep? Those small, manageable vices or halfway commitments that you've put to work, thinking you can control them. Signing treaties with your own spiritual weaknesses offers a peace that is completely fabricated. The temptation to cohabitate with these small flaws eventually leads to the same erosion the Israelites faced. Instead of settling for being a halfway follower, seek the clarity of faith necessary to confront those comfortable blind spots. True growth leaves no room for pragmatic surrender. If you want the high ground, the unconquered corners must be cleared. You make a mistake, you deal with the uncomfortable fallout, and promise yourself it will never happen again. Yet, a month later, you are standing in the exact same spot, repeating the exact same error. This recurring loop appears throughout human history, specifically documented 3,000 years ago in the records of ancient Israel. They struggled with a pattern of behavior that mirrors our modern habits with startling precision. By examining the structure of their story in Judges chapter 2, we can build a specific response to the setbacks you are facing today. To begin, you will need a notebook and a pen. I want you to identify one specific recurring setback in your life that you are ready to address. The book of Judges describes a national cycle of failure, but its value lies in how it illustrates the psychological transition from comfort to compromise. Seeing your struggle as part of this universal human experience is the first step toward regaining control. The narrative begins with a transition of power. The era of Moses and Joshua, defined by strong leadership and clear direction, had ended. Israel entered the time of the Judges, a period marked by a lack of central authority and a tendency toward chaos. The text identifies 4 distinct phases that repeated for generations. It began with the breaking of a covenant, followed by a period of trials or discipline. Eventually, the people cry out for help, leading to a period of rescue. This 4-part sequence became a closed loop. Once rescued, the people drifted back to the initial compromise, and the hardship cycle started again. When we map our own recurring failures against these 4 steps, we can identify exactly where we are in the sequence and what we need to do to stop the rotation. We start with step 1, personal ownership. The book of Judges notes a generational gap where the children of the faithful forgot the lessons of their parents. Success and discipline are not inherited. They must be practiced by each person individually. Write down your setback on your paper now. You must take absolute responsibility for this specific struggle. Relying on how you were raised or your past successes will not help you here. This is your own race to run. For step 2, draw a line on your paper. Below it, list the specific, painful consequences this habit causes today. Do not minimize them. In the ancient text, these consequences are called discipline. The purpose of this hardship was to wake the people up. The pain you feel from your setback is a signal designed to stop you from continuing down a destructive path. Facing the reality of these consequences provides the friction needed to slow the cycle down. Avoiding the pain only allows the habit to continue. Step 3 is the act of seeking external help. On your paper, write down the name of one person you will reach out to today. Just as the Israelites could not break their cycle without calling for help, you cannot break a deeply ingrained habit alone. Seeking assistance is the moment you stop trying to solve the problem with the same mindset that created it. Pause this video right now. Send a text to an accountability partner, call a mentor, or take a moment for prayer. Do not wait until later. Vulnerability is the necessary turning point. It is the action that shifts you from the phase of hardship into the phase of recovery. Finally, step 4 is the implementation of a new boundary. Write down one concrete action or rule you will put in place today to keep the cycle from starting again. The text emphasizes that whenever the people turned back, they were met with mercy. This means your focus should be entirely on your next move, not on the guilt of your past mistakes. When you implement a boundary, you change the shape of your routine. The closed circle breaks. Instead of returning to the same point of failure, you begin to move in a new direction. This is the process of moving forward. Each time you respect that new boundary, you distance yourself from the old pattern. Recovery in this framework is the act of physically changing your environment and your choices so you no longer land in the same place twice. Look at your paper. You have identified your setback, acknowledged its cost, requested help, and set a boundary. You have a functioning plan to move forward. The Book of Judges shows us that while falling into these cycles is part of being human, staying in them is a choice. You now have the tools to recognize the pattern before it repeats. The ancient promise remains. Whenever you decide to turn back toward the right path, the help you need is available. Keep your plan on your desk this week as a reminder of the commitments you've made. Subscribe if you want to see more models for change derived from historical texts. These ancient records offer a clear model for identifying and stopping the habits that keep us stuck. Use this framework to start your climb. The epic battles for the Promised Land were finally over. But for the Israelites, the end of the war brought a new kind of danger. Instead of finishing the task and securing the borders, they chose the path of least resistance. They laid down their shields and settled into the comfort of their surroundings. This comfort quickly turned into compromise. They moved into the same neighborhoods, intermarried with their families, and eventually adopted their rituals. Within a few years, they were actively serving the very gods their ancestors had been warned against. This shift highlights a recurring failure in the human story. Faith does not automatically transfer from one generation to the next. Because the parents chose ease over instruction, a new generation grew up with no personal knowledge of God or the struggle required to reach the land they now call home. Judges 3 reveals that God intentionally left the Canaanite enemies in the land. He chose not to drive them out entirely, leaving a hostile presence right at the doorstep of the Israelites. From a divine perspective, a life of total comfort is a liability. God uses the presence of these enemies as a crucible, a necessary pressure to test and refine a generation that has never known the cost of their own freedom. When Israel failed that test, it triggered a predictable cycle that would define their history for centuries. This loop operates in 4 specific stages. In the top quadrant, the people do evil in the eyes of the Lord. This action moves the cycle downward into oppression, as God allows their enemies to gain the upper hand as a form of discipline. Only when the oppression becomes unbearable do the Israelites hit rock bottom. Their complacency is finally replaced by desperation, leading them to cry out for help. God responds by raising up a savior, a judge who defeats the enemy and restores peace. This completes the loop, bringing the nation back to a state of rest, where the cycle of comfort and sin often begins all over again. The Israelites are depicted as constantly wavering, yet God remains anchored to the covenant He made with their ancestors. Instead of abandoning a corrupted people, He patiently waits for them to turn back toward Him. This pattern illustrates how a society's focus shifts when it is no longer tested. When the external pressures that forged a people's faith disappear, the drive to maintain their foundational values tends to fade, replaced by the immediate demands of personal comfort. To break this deadlock, God bypassed the compromised masses and called upon specific individuals, Othniel and Ehud. These leaders stood in sharp contrast to their peers. While the general population was retreating in panic or assimilating to survive, Othniel and Ehud acted with calculated courage and clear strategic goals. The narrative attributes their success to a specific source. The Spirit of the Lord was upon them. They didn't rely on superior weaponry. They operated under an authority that their enemies couldn't match. The text presents Othniel as a holy servant, suggesting that his leadership was inseparable from his character. This alignment indicates that a deep reverence for God is the prerequisite for the wisdom needed to lead a liberation. Their deliverance of the nation required exact obedience. They followed divine instructions to the letter, even when those plans defied conventional military logic. In this era, partial compliance would have been indistinguishable from failure. The accounts of these judges indicate that national restoration begins with leaders who reject the prevailing compromise. They demonstrate that true authority is rooted in a life strictly aligned with the standards they are called to defend. Because of the obedience of these leaders, the nation was granted 40 years of peace. But as the diagram spins through history, we see the tragic irony of that rest. Peace merely resets the board. Without the pressure of the enemy, the next generation falls right back into the comfort trap, restarting the loop of rebellion and punishment. This ancient timeline serves as a mirror. Human nature still defaults to apathy whenever life becomes easy. We find it just as difficult as the Israelites did to maintain a sense of purpose when we are no longer in crisis. This reframes our understanding of modern trials. The tests God permits are not just obstacles. They are a form of mercy designed to wake us up before we drift into a total spiritual collapse. To break this cycle individually, we have to move beyond an inherited passive faith. Every generation and every person must seek a first-hand relationship with God that isn't dependent on the convictions of the past. We adopt the strategy of the judges when we commit to a holy lifestyle and refuse to blend into the secular ideologies of our time. It is a choice to remain distinct in a world that encourages us to assimilate. Humanity may be prone to this cycle of rebellion, but the book of Judges shows that God is even more persistent in his mercy. It reminds us that no matter how many times the loop repeats, true repentance will always be met with restoration. For 20 agonizing years, the Israelite people lived under a brutal military occupation in the land of Canaan. Their oppressors controlled the region using the absolute pinnacle of Bronze Age military engineering, the Iron Chariot. Commander Sisera deployed a massive fleet of 900 heavy chariots. This force formed an impenetrable blockade across the flatlands, isolating scattered settlements and severing every major trade route. This overwhelming display of hard power fractured the resistance and paralyzed an entire nation into submission. Against an armor-plated blockade, fighting back appeared to be a mathematical impossibility. The only spiritual authority holding Israel together was a prophet named Deborah. Unarmed, she still commanded the absolute spiritual conviction of the people. She summons General Barak with a precise military directive: mobilize 10,000 men and draw the Canaanite forces toward the elevated slopes of Mount Tabor. But Barak looks at his infantry, and he looks at the mechanized fleet below. The sheer terror of those chariots paralyzes him. He refuses to march unless Deborah physically walks onto the battlefield to accompany him. Because Barak requires human reassurance over a divine promise, Deborah issues a sharp prophecy. The battle will be won, but Barak will forfeit the honor of the final kill. The commanding general's glory will be diverted entirely to a woman. Barak's hesitation creates a sudden leadership vacuum. God's plan to liberate the region will proceed with or without the general's confidence, but his fear guarantees he will be replaced by a very unlikely substitute. The moment of truth arrives. Barak's infantry pours down from the safety of Mount Tabor, rushing directly into the open plains to meet a terrifying charge from Sisera's 900 chariots. Then, the environment itself suddenly turns against the Canaanites. A catastrophic weather event violently breaks open the sky. The Kishon River bursts its banks, turning the flat plains into a sprawling, inescapable mud trap. The physics are brutal. Thousands of pounds of iron sink into the earth, completely immobilizing Sisera's once unstoppable fleet. You can see the reality of this terrain here. Once a flash flood saturates this soil, a high-speed, heavy-wheeled vehicle has absolutely zero maneuverability. The Israelites didn't need superior armor to break the blockade. A perfectly timed natural disaster weaponized the terrain, turning the enemy's greatest technological strength into a fatal vulnerability. With his entire war machine trapped in the mud, Commander Sisera abandons his troops. He flees on foot, eventually seeking refuge at an isolated nomadic camp he assumes is friendly, neutral territory. This is where Jael enters the historical record. She holds no military rank. She is an ordinary civilian stepping squarely into the gap left by Barak. She executes a flawless tactical deception. She offers the exhausted general sanctuary, gives him milk to drink, and covers him with a blanket so he can sleep in peace. She doesn't reach for a forged sword. She grabs a mundane piece of primitive camping equipment. With the general deep in sleep, Jael takes the heavy wooden peg and a household hammer, driving it straight through his temple and pinning him to the ground in one swift, brutal strike. The man who commanded 900 war machines was defeated by a housewife with a piece of wood. In the critical moment, his specialized weaponry and rank were useless against her sheer decisiveness. Barak stood atop the mountain with an army and a divine promise, yet he stalled for a human guarantee. Jael stood alone in a tent with a household tool, yet she struck without hesitation. We all face our own 900 iron chariots. These are the intimidating, insurmountable obstacles that paralyze us: a sudden economic collapse, a terrifying health crisis, or a massive, well-funded industry rival. Confronted by these forces, we often stall. We wait for perfect conditions, demand a hand to hold, and watch the window of opportunity close while we wait for a guarantee that isn't coming. We need to stop staring at the heavy armor of our problems and look at the tent pegs we already possess. These are our mundane daily skills, our entry-level positions, the seemingly insignificant resources sitting right on our desks. You don't need a supernatural sword to confront the massive barriers in your life. You need to firmly grasp the ordinary tools you have been given and step confidently into the gap. Genuine faith does not wait for absolute certainty. It boldly strikes with a simple tent peg, trusting the timing of a God who can wash away the chariots. You're stuck. The pressure is relentless. The obstacles keep piling up, and you're starting to wonder if you're just on a run of bad luck, or if something much larger is trying to get your attention. Grab a pen and a blank piece of paper. Think of the single most frustrating challenge you are facing right now, and hold it at the front of your mind. Over the next 5 minutes, we are going to run a faith alignment check. We will look at the patterns recorded in the Song of Deborah to understand the logic behind your current struggle. By the time we finish, you will have a specific, practical step to get your life back in sync with God's power. Let's start the check. Step 1 is the discipline diagnosis. To understand your current situation, we look at the historical mirror provided in the book of Judges. The ancient Israelites were locked into a generational pattern of behavior. It started with peace. Once comfortable, they drifted to chase foreign idols. Judges 5 details the consequence. Choosing new gods brought war to their city gates. They cried out in distress. God raised a judge to rescue them, restarting the cycle of peace. Apply that cycle to your own life. Look at your priorities over the last few months. Have you let career obsession, financial greed, or personal pride take the throne? Take your pen. Write down any modern new gods you have recently elevated above God in your daily routine. Identifying these misaligned priorities is the required first step. You are diagnosing why war has suddenly reached the gates of your personal life. Step 2 is applying the love correction filter. When you see the gap between your actions and God's standard, it is easy to assume God is angry and looking to punish you. But Revelation 3:19 and Hebrews 12:6 provide a different perspective. Those whom I love, I reprove and discipline. This indicates that discipline is a function of His love for you. Divine discipline acts as protective redirection. It is God using His authority to pull you back from a path that ends in a cliff edge. On your paper, underneath your list of priorities, write out this sentence: God is using this hardship to redirect my path. In the biblical framework, love and correction are two halves of the same mechanism. They are locked together. This requires a change in how you react to pain. You must stop asking, "Why me?" and start asking, "What are you trying to teach me right now?" Applying this filter removes the weight of condemnation. Once you view the struggle as guidance, your mind is free to take forward-moving action. Step 3 is the coworker's pivot. Recognizing God's discipline is only half the process. God requires human participation to secure the victory. The Song of Deborah provides a contrast in how people respond to God's call, beginning with the inhabitants of a town called Meroz. The angel of the Lord delivered a curse upon Meroz because they stayed home. They chose a bystander mentality and failed to help God's cause. Look instead at the actions of Deborah and Jael. Jael received blessing because she took decisive, physical action to cooperate with God's unfolding will. This is the operational lesson of Judges chapter 5. The outcome Deborah celebrates happens when God's power combines with a person's willingness to step up. Look at your paper. Write down one concrete physical action you can take today to realign with God. Specify the exact time you will make a phone call or the specific habit you will stop. Committing this single actionable step to paper transitions you into the role of a co-worker with God. You now hold 3 components of the faith alignment check: the diagnosis, the filter, and the pivot. You have identified the root idolatry and reframed your hardship as God's loving discipline. Now, look at the specific physical action step you wrote down in the final section. Success is found when you execute that step today. You are stepping out of the shadows and into the blessing of divine cooperation. Have you ever felt entirely paralyzed by the sheer size of the problem in front of you? Imagine an invading force so massive it consumes every resource you have. One minute your field is full, and the next it's wiped out, leaving you exhausted and hiding in the dark. Thousands of years ago, a man named Gideon lived in that exact reality. You can find his account in Judges chapter 6, and he serves as a case study for anyone trapped by crippling self-doubt. We are taking the theological insights from this original Chinese Bible study and translating them into a clear step-by-step tutorial. We will break down Gideon's experience into a 4-step framework. By completing these steps, you turn the abstract concept of faith into a concrete, executable process to build your spiritual confidence. Step 1 starts in a hole in the ground. Gideon is poor, terrified, and threshing his wheat inside a sunken winepress because he wants to avoid detection by the enemy raiders. An angel appears to him in that pit and delivers a greeting that completely contradicts the situation. The angel looks at this hiding man and calls him a mighty warrior. This illustrates what we call a prophetic declaration. On the left is the current reality of a frightened man. On the right is the intended future, a massive glowing silhouette. A prophetic declaration calls out that future truth before it actually exists. To begin your own process, you have to stop defining your capabilities by your current circumstances and fears. The foundational step to building confidence is accepting and internalizing God's prophetic view of your potential, rather than trusting your own self-doubt. Step 2 requires action. Historically, the nation of Israel was failing and vulnerable because they had turned to idol worship. Before Gideon could lead the nation, God gave him a strict prerequisite. He had to take a hammer and physically smash his own father's idols. Gideon had to clean up his private life before he could have any public influence. He was terrified to do this. He waited until it was completely dark to tear the altar down, but he still completed the task. Bravery is taking the necessary action despite your fear. For you, this means identifying the false comforts or distractions that are taking God's place in your life and removing them. True spiritual confidence requires you to aggressively clean out your internal compromises, even if you have to do it afraid. Step 3 is about building a foundation of certainty. Gideon famously used a piece of sheep's wool, a fleece, to test God's instructions. Many people make the mistake of believing that asking God for a sign is an act of rebellion. Gideon describes himself as the least in his family and his clan as the weakest. He isn't asking for a sign to find an excuse to say no. He is looking for a reason to say yes, despite his low self-image. Because he wanted to obey but lacked the internal confidence, God provided the external proof he needed. Look at this logic graphic. Gideon asks for impossible specificity, the wool soaked with dew, while the dirt remains bone dry. Then he reverses the test to prove it wasn't a natural anomaly. The wool stays dry and the ground floods. God performs both. When you are facing a major step, it is permissible to ask God for a clear sign or an open door to validate your direction. God provides divine confirmation to support our obedience and resolve the uncertainty that keeps us paralyzed. Step 4 is the activation. This is the moment the Spirit of the Lord comes upon Gideon, equipping him for action. We call this the anointing. It is the critical element that turns an isolated individual into a leader with influence. When Gideon blows the horn under this anointing, people actually show up to follow him. This requirement applies directly to modern roles. If you are preaching or teaching, leading worship, or managing a cell group, you need this equipping to be effective. Do not confuse crippling fear with humility. Hiding from your calling because you feel inadequate is a weakness, not a virtue to be protected. You cannot execute spiritual leadership on human strength alone. It requires asking for and operating in the power of the Holy Spirit. We have covered the entire journey, adopting a prophetic vision, removing internal idols, securing divine certainty, and receiving the Spirit. Look at this split screen. On the left is where Gideon started, cowering in a dark, confined space. On the right is his final state, a leader standing on a hill with an army at his back. This transition was built on the sequence of vision, internal cleanup, and divine confirmation. Gideon's story suggests that influence isn't a personality trait you're born with, but a result of these specific spiritual alignment steps. Here is your immediate next step. Take 1 minute right now and pray specifically for the Holy Spirit's anointing over the current challenge you are facing. Stop hiding. It is time to step out of the winepress and into your anointed role. The account of Gideon in the Book of Judges contains a specific look at asymmetrical warfare, a scenario where a small, unconventional force manages to dismantle a numerically superior enemy. Gideon begins the campaign with 32,000 Israelite troops. They are positioned against a Midianite force of such scale that the text describes them as a numerically superior force. Despite being outnumbered, Gideon receives a directive that runs counter to military logic. 32,000 men are too many for the coming battle. The reasoning for this reduction is based on the credit for the victory. If Israel wins with their current numbers, the narrative argues they will claim the success was achieved through their own strength. This sets up this central problem. How can a commander lose 99% of his manpower and still expect to secure a total rout of the enemy? The reduction happens in 2 stages. First, Gideon filters the troops based on their fear. He announces that anyone who is afraid is free to leave the front lines. 22,000 men leave the campaign immediately, leaving Gideon with 10,000. The second stage involves a water test. As the men drink from a stream, a group of just 300 men is separated from the other 9,700. The division is based on posture. Most of the men knelt down to drink directly from the water. The 300 who were chosen stayed on their feet and lapped water from their hands, maintaining a position that allowed them to keep their eyes on their surroundings. Gideon now has his 300 soldiers, but the scale of the opposing army remains a source of personal concern for him. To gather intelligence, Gideon performs a night reconnaissance mission. He moves through the grass to the edge of the Midianite camp to listen. He overhears an enemy soldier describing a dream about a loaf of barley bread destroying a Midianite tent. The interpretation he hears confirms that the Midianites are already experiencing a drop in morale and fear an Israelite attack. These 2 elements, the selection of the 300 and the intelligence gathered at the camp, shift the psychological momentum. Gideon now has a specific force and the knowledge that his enemy is vulnerable to panic. For the raid, the 300 men are given unconventional equipment. They do not carry swords. Each man receives a trumpet, an empty pitcher, with a torch hidden inside it. Gideon divides the men into 3 companies of 100. They move into flanking positions at 3 different points, surrounding the Midianites. They wait for the middle watch, just after the changing of the guard, to ensure the enemy is at maximum disorientation. At Gideon's signal, all 300 men smash their pitchers, reveal their torches, and blow their trumpets at the same time. The goal is to use sound and light to create the illusion of a much larger army. By attacking from 3 sides in the dark, they make it impossible for the Midianites to accurately gauge the size of the force they are facing. The Midianites wake to the sudden noise and appearance of fire. Panic spreads through the camp as soldiers react to the sensory overload. In the confusion, the Midianites begin fighting one another. This internal chaos leads to a total retreat, with the enemy army fleeing the site without Gideon's men ever needing to engage in hand-to-hand combat. This maneuver demonstrates how sensory tactics and psychological pressure can be used to neutralize a large numerical advantage. Once the initial lines were broken by the 300, the rest of the Israelite forces were called in to pursue the retreating army and complete the victory. This brings us back to the original mandate, the specific requirement to use only 300 men. While the tactics were effective, they were only necessary because the conventional army had been removed from the equation. The account suggests that numerical disadvantage is used as a prerequisite for this kind of success. By removing standard military resources, the narrative highlights the source of the victory as something other than human effort. By stripping away reliance on numbers and self-sufficiency, the account of Gideon concludes that when the victory is won, the credit belongs entirely to divine intervention. We tend to think the most dangerous moment in any spiritual battle is when swords are clashing and the fight is at its absolute peak. But the 8th chapter of the Book of Judges offers a different perspective. It reads less like a traditional victory lap and far more like a psychological autopsy of a hero's downfall. Here's the situation. Gideon has just pulled off the impossible. With an army stripped down to a mere 300 men, he shattered the massive Midianite forces. By all metrics, he is standing at the summit of his spiritual life. Yet, instead of ushering in a season of peace and stability, the narrative takes a sharp turn. In the immediate aftermath of this incredible triumph, Gideon initiates a rapid, self-inflicted descent into darkness. The spiritual vacuum left behind once a war is won often poses a more potent threat to a believer than the enemy they just conquered. At first, Gideon continues to operate with the wisdom that won the war. When the Ephraimites aggressively confront him, furious that they were left out of the initial battle, Gideon uses deep humility and gentle words to de-escalate what could have easily become a bloody civil war. But watch what happens next. As he pursues the remaining enemy kings, Gideon asks the men of Succoth and Penuel for basic supplies to feed his exhausted troops. They refuse him. His reaction is brutal and completely disproportionate. He doesn't just pass them by, he promises violence. He later returns to torture the elders of Succoth with desert thorns and tears down the tower of Penuel, killing his own countrymen. Read through these verses carefully, and you will notice a glaring absence. Earlier in the story, we are explicitly told the Spirit of the Lord guided Gideon. Now, God is entirely missing from the text. The intense pressure of the battle forced him to rely on God. But with the external threat eliminated, that reliance vanishes, allowing his deep-seated insecurities to swing wildly out of control and dictate his actions. When we stop actively depending on God's direction, our unhealed trauma and personal anger inevitably grab the steering wheel. The Israelites are so thrilled with the military victory that they offer Gideon the ultimate prize, a hereditary kingship. They ask him and his descendants to rule over them permanently. Gideon's response is flawless. He rejects the crown with perfect theological precision, declaring, "I will not rule over you. The Lord will rule over you." He says all the right things, but his actions immediately contradict him. Almost in the same breath, he demands a portion of the plundered gold from his troops, acting exactly like the monarch he just claimed he didn't want to be. With roughly 43 pounds of gold, he constructs an ephod, a sacred priestly garment. He likely does this with the genuine intention of memorializing their great victory and honoring God's deliverance. But God never commanded this. Because it bypassed divine instruction, this unauthorized monument slowly warps into an object of obsessive worship for the Israelites. This single act of compromise becomes a deadly trap. It ruins his own family and drags the entire nation right back into the idolatry they had just fought so hard to escape. Possessing the correct theological vocabulary means absolutely nothing if it serves as a smokescreen for unsanctified ambition. Gideon shattered the Midianite army, but he completely lost the internal war against his own pride. Endurance through the trial is only half the battle. The spiritual life requires a strict, deliberate protocol for managing the pride that follows. First, audit your ambition.
You must instantly redirect praise back to God, or success will breed destructive pride. Second, interrogate your good intentions. Without explicit divine guidance, yesterday's victory tools become tomorrow's idols. Finally, verbalizing authority isn't enough. You need functional submission to his power. The Book of Judges reminds us that human power carries an expiration date. Ultimate victory is determined by how faithfully you finish the entire race.
In a single morning, 70 brothers are executed on one stone. It is a calculated political purge recorded in Judges chapter 9. To understand how the nation reached this point of domestic bloodshed, we have to look backward. The victim's father was Gideon, a hero who famously refused the crown, insisting that God was the only true king Israel needed. Yet later in life, Gideon made quiet, lethal compromises. He took multiple wives, fracturing his household. He also forged a golden object called an ephod. What started as a memorial devolved into an object of widespread idol worship. Gideon's subtle idolatry hollowed out Israel's spiritual foundation. Without a firm reliance on divine leadership, the surrounding culture looked highly appealing. The people started craving a human ruler to function like the neighboring nations. Into that vacuum stepped Abimelech. He was Gideon's illegitimate son, born to a concubine from the city of Shechem. His very name translates to, "My father is king," a title that explicitly challenged Gideon's public stance and exposed a deep, toxic ambition simmering beneath the surface. Abimelech moved aggressively to seize control. He traveled to Shechem, manipulated the local leaders using their shared blood ties, and secured funding taken directly from the temple of Baal. With that temple silver, he hired a band of mercenaries to carry out the purge of his own family. Gideon's public victories were erased by his private failures. A respected leader's small, tolerated sins built the scaffolding his son used to collapse the community a generation later. Abimelech's purge is nearly absolute. He clears all political opposition and seizes power, but he makes one critical error. The youngest brother, Jotham, escapes the massacre. Jotham climbs to the top of Mount Gerizim, a vantage point directly overlooking the city of Shechem. From there, he shouts down a prophetic warning to the people who funded his family's murder. He delivers what is known as the fable of the trees. The trees of the forest are looking for a king. They approach the olive tree, the fig tree, and the vine. All three reject the offer of supreme power. They refuse to abandon their work of producing oil, fruit, and wine for the sake of ruling over others. Desperate, the trees finally ask the bramble bush. The bramble, a useless, thorny weed that produces nothing, eagerly accepts the crown. It immediately demands total submission, threatening to burn down the majestic cedars of Lebanon if they disobey. Jotham doesn't leave the metaphor up to interpretation. Abimelech is the bramble. He has no virtue and produces no value for the people, yet he is violently desperate to control them. Good leadership finds its core purpose in serving others and producing fruit. Bramble leaders lack that ability. To maintain their grip on a position they haven't earned, they must constantly threaten to burn their own community to the ground. The consequences of choosing the bramble don't happen overnight. 3 years pass. God often allows sin to fully mature, forcing the people to taste the bitter fruit of their own choices. The alliance between Abimelech and his financial backers finally fractures. An evil spirit of division rises between them, sparking a civil war in the very streets that brought Abimelech to power. The fighting reaches a climax at the town of Thebez. Abimelech pushes the defending forces back into a stone defensive tower in the city center. True to Jotham's prophecy, the bramble prepares to set the structure on fire, attempting to burn civilians alive. But he gets too close. An unnamed woman, trapped at the top of the tower, heaves an upper millstone over the edge. It plummets directly onto Abimelech, crushing his skull. Dying on the ground, Abimelech uses his final breath to issue an order. He commands his armor-bearer to draw a sword and execute him, terrified that history will remember him as a king defeated by a woman. He dies exactly as he ruled, blinded by his own pride and obsessed with an image he never earned. When the dust settles, the city of Shechem lies in ruins, and Abimelech is dead.
Jotham's warning on Mount Gerizim played out with precision. The bramble and the trees destroyed each other. This flowchart maps the progression from spiritual compromise and unchecked ambition to an inevitable mutual destruction. Power built on idolatry and violence is destined to collapse in on itself. Lasting peace and stability manifest when a community acknowledges God as the ultimate king and submits to his rule, rather than reaching for total control. This leaves us with an uncomfortable question to ask ourselves.
In your own life, your career, or your family, are you focused on producing fruit where you were planted, or are you constantly scheming for more control? It also gives us a standard for vetting those who lead us. We should be handing authority to people who revere God and deeply hate corruption. When we give power to charisma or wealth, we shouldn't be surprised when the bramble threatens the forest. And it requires us to audit our personal margins. Gideon thought a little idol worship wouldn't hurt. We have to examine our own small moral compromises today, so they don't calcify into the idolatry that destroys us tomorrow. You cannot escape the harvest of what you plant. The question is simply which path you will cultivate, the destructive ambition of the bramble, or the quiet, faithful service of the olive tree. You sit down, pull out your phone, and lose another 2 hours to mindless scrolling before you even realize it. It is an incredibly frustrating feeling. You know exactly how damaging the habit is, yet you feel powerless to stop. Human history is littered with records of people trapped in these same behavioral treadmills, long before the invention of the smartphone. We can trace the anatomy of this trap back to a 3,000-year-old text, the Book of Judges, chapter 10, which describes the spiritual cycle. Analyzing this ancient record provides a diagnostic tool to identify the mechanics of why we stay stuck in these repeating patterns. The text opens during an era of peace and prosperity for ancient Israel. Under Tala and Jair, the nation thrives for decades. Jair alone oversees 30 wealthy cities. This prosperity bred complacency. The Israelites abandoned core values to worship foreign idols, marking the first stage. We see this today when comfort leads us to prioritize modern idols, chasing status, wealth, or constant distraction. In the biblical account, this abandonment resulted in 18 years of crushing rule under the Philistines and Ammonites. That historical subjugation mirrors the heavy weight of anxiety and the real-life consequences that follow when our own destructive habits take over. The pattern suggests unchecked comfort often facilitates environments that eventually become our greatest burdens. Eventually, Israel hits rock bottom. In the third stage, they reach total despair and beg for rescue. This is the familiar, "I will never do this again" moment, a desperate plea for a way out while the cycle tries to pull us back. But the text records a startling response. God initially refuses to help, telling the Israelites to seek rescue from the false gods they chose instead. This rejection forced a pivot. Rather than just offering more tears, the Israelites took physical action and destroyed their foreign idols. When their actions proved their intent, the text says God was moved by their misery. He intervened, bringing the cycle to an end. There is a vital distinction here. Regret is feeling sorry because of the pain, while repentance is changing the behavior that caused the pain. Divine mercy responded to tangible proof of changed behavior, not the volume of their distress. Breaking a personal loop requires moving past the stage of regret and into the stage of active repentance. The first step is to identify your modern idol. This involves pinpointing the specific habit, mindset, or addiction you rely on for a false sense of comfort. Step 2 is taking tangible action. Internal apologies rarely change the outcome or break the pattern. You have to delete the app, sever the toxic relationship, or physically remove the temptation from your daily environment. The final step is to recommit to your true purpose, mirroring how Israel returned to serving only the divine. The cycle of Judges 10 demonstrates that while mercy and freedom are available, they follow the courage of making a real physical change. Open the Bible to the era of the Judges, and you'll find one of the most chaotic periods in Israelite history. It was a time defined by a cycle of rebellion, consequence, and desperate need for rescue. The immediate crisis in chapter 11 is geographic and existential.
An aggressive Ammonite army is gathering out in this harsh terrain, preparing to launch a massive strike against the Israelites living in the region of Gilead. The elders of Gilead are panicking. They have soldiers, but they face a complete leadership vacuum. There is no capable military commander among them to actually direct a defense. Their only option is Jephthah. He is known as a mighty, highly capable warrior, but he's also a deeply stigmatized outcast. His mother was a prostitute, and because of that, his half-brothers stripped him of his inheritance and banished him. The situation presents a bitter irony. The respected, established elders of Gilead find themselves staring down an approaching army, forced to seek their salvation from the exact man their society casually threw away. In the years following his exile, Jephthah lived on the fringes, leading a rough band of scoundrels and outlaws in the wilderness. So the elders swallow their pride, travel out to his camp in the margins of society, and plead with him to come back and lead their forces against the Ammonites. Jephthah negotiates the terms, agrees to return, and secures a new position. The former exile officially becomes the head and commander of his people. This opening sequence highlights a core spiritual reality. Divine purpose does not require a pristine pedigree. God is perfectly willing to use anyone as his vessel, no matter how unpopular they are or how humble their origins might be. This river valley is the contested land of Gilead. And instead of charging straight into a bloodbath to defend it, Jephthah surprises everyone by acting as a statesman. He sends messengers to the Ammonite king to attempt a diplomatic resolution. His argument is strictly historical and logical. He points out that Israel has occupied this specific territory for 300 years, and for 3 centuries the two nations have lived in peace. As the saying goes, river wire doesn't offend well water. He follows that up with a theological warning. He states that God gave this land to the Israelites, making any Ammonite invasion entirely unjust. If they attack, God will act as the judge between them. The negotiation fails completely. The Ammonite king ignores the message, closing the door on peace and making a violent collision unavoidable. At this exact moment, the biblical text notes that the Spirit of the Lord comes upon Jephthah. Before a single sword is drawn, he has divine backing. His victory is assured. But right here, Jephthah's psychology fractures. Despite visibly carrying the Spirit of God, he feels a sudden, desperate urge to bargain for the win. He makes a heavy, terrifying oath. He tells God that if he returns home in peace from the battle, whatever first comes out the doors of his house to meet him will be sacrificed as a burnt offering. He marches his army into Ammonite territory and secures a massive, sweeping victory. The threat to Israel is completely neutralized. Yet the triumph turns to ash the moment he returns home. The very first person to step through his doorway, dancing with a tambourine to celebrate her father's safe return, is his only beloved daughter. Jephthah is utterly devastated. He tears his clothes in grief, but he refuses to break the promise he made to God. He follows through on the vow, which results in his daughter dedicating her entire life to celebrate service at the tabernacle. The entire chapter pivots on this painful duality. A brilliant national triumph is permanently overshadowed by a self-inflicted private tragedy. Why would a capable commander, already empowered by the Spirit of God, feel compelled to make such a reckless, high-stakes deal? This diagram illustrates a profound imbalance. With the Spirit of God already resting on him, the added weight of the vow provided no extra power, only an unnecessary burden on the scale that fundamentally changed nothing about the battle's outcome. Years spent as a rejected outcast likely hardened this perspective. After being cast out by his own flesh and blood, Jephthah navigated a world where every scrap of influence or survival had to be bartered for. He approached the Creator with the same transactional caution he used to survive the wilderness. That is the danger of spiritual insecurity. It drives us to panic and try to force God's hand with grand gestures, rather than simply resting in the grace He has already provided. The New Testament offers a direct, definitive remedy to this exact kind of spiritual anxiety. In his Sermon on the Mount, Jesus specifically commands his followers not to swear grand oaths in an attempt to make their words carry more weight. The Epistle of James echoes this rule precisely. issuing a strict warning to believers against making desperate, sweeping vows to heaven. The biblical standard is a direct contrast to Jephthah's destructive contract. It asks for simple integrity. Jesus teaches that a person's yes should just mean yes, and their no should just mean no. God does not require our panicked transactional promises to act on our behalf. He simply asks for our honest trust and our daily obedience.
In modern circles, the term Shibboleth describes an arbitrary custom or a specific set of jargon used to distinguish an in-group from an out-group. It's a social test of belonging, often hidden in plain sight. The origins of the term trace back thousands of years to a guarded crossing on the Jordan River. These high earthen banks served as a physical boundary where a desperate group of soldiers attempted to flee a lost battle. To cross, each man was forced to pronounce a single password, Shibboleth. It was an ordinary word meaning an ear of grain, chosen for one specific phonetic reason. The Gileadite guards knew their enemies from the tribe of Ephraim spoke a different dialect. While the guards used a soft sh sound, the Ephraimites were physically accustomed to a hard S. They could only say Sibboleth. Missing that single H was an immediate death sentence. 42,000 individuals were identified by their accent and executed right there on the riverbank. The tragedy lies in the identity of the victims. These were fellow Israelites, men who shared the same history of escaping Egypt and who had inherited the Promised Land alongside the very men now killing them. This event leaves us with a haunting question. How does a unified people fracture so violently that a regional accent becomes a valid reason for brothers to slaughter one another? To understand the massacre at the river, we have to look at the outbreak of tribal pride that occurred just days before. The Gileadites, led by Jephthah, had just secured a major victory against the Ammonites. It was only after the fighting ended that the men of Ephraim arrived. Rather than celebrating peace, the Ephraimites were incensed that they hadn't been credited for the victory. They threatened to burn Jephthah's house down, prioritizing their status over the safety of the nation. This diagram illustrates the shift in threat dynamics. The energy once used to defend against a foreign invader has turned inward. The community has fractured into two violently opposed clusters, all centered on a dispute over who deserves the credit for the win. In this instance, internal fractures driven by petty jealousy and a demand for recognition acted as the direct precursors to a total breakdown of the community. This wasn't the first time the tribe of Ephraim had acted this way. Years earlier, the judge Gideon faced an identical grievance from the same group of people. Gideon chose a strategy of diffusion. He used a soft answer, intentionally humbling himself to soothe their egos and keep the nation unified. Jephthah took the opposite path. He met their toxic threats with catastrophic violence, choosing a hardline retaliation that escalated the dispute into a civil war. The source text notes a significant shift. While the Holy Spirit guided Jephthah against external enemies, the Spirit is never mentioned during this internal conflict. This reflects a specific type of moral failure, the way human pride can transform God-given gifts, like military courage and persuasive rhetoric, into tools used to dismantle one's own community. Jephthah was factually correct. The Ephraimites were being unreasonable. But by using his rightness to justify a massacre, he won the argument at the cost of his people's future. We no longer stand at river crossings executing people over pronunciation, but the impulse to test who belongs in our tribe remains a constant in human behavior. Modern communities often create invisible pronunciation tests using specific jargon, political stances, or lifestyle choices. This mechanism rejects even microscopic deviations from the template. It categorizes people into absolute camps of us versus them, pushing others entirely outside the circle of belonging. This exclusionary impulse is often framed as a commitment to high standards. However, the result is often the same as it was at the Jordan River: the steady erosion of unity through the pursuit of absolute conformity. It is a difficult truth. In our disputes, our rigid adherence to being right can cause more lasting damage than the original error.
The book of James highlights the necessity of taming the tongue to prevent this kind of escalation. Controlling our speech is presented as the primary way to keep a community from burning itself down. Instead of setting up Shibboleth tests to expose the failures of others, we have the option to use our strength to support them. This is the difference between a crossing guard and someone stopping to wash a brother's feet. True maturity means refusing to turn our personal principles into deadly crossing points. It means choosing the survival of the community over the hollow satisfaction of being the last one standing.
When you look closely at the first 24 verses of Judges chapter 13, you find a narrative that functions as more than a simple biography. To understand the arrival of Samson, we have to look at the era he was born into. The book of Judges records a repetitive descending cycle. The people rebel, they are oppressed, they cry for help, and a leader arrives to deliver them, only for the pattern to start all over again. By the time we reach this chapter, the cycle is failing. The people have stopped crying out for help. They have become so accustomed to their own defeat that they no longer attempt to follow divine instructions, even with leaders in place to guide them. Into this atmosphere of total stagnation, God intervenes. He doesn't send an army. He announces a birth. This origin story for Samson contains specific details that mirror a later, more significant historical arrival. By comparing the two, we can see how this ancient text anticipates a future solution to the human cycle. We can observe this by placing the birth of Samson in Judges 13 alongside the birth of Jesus in Luke chapter 1. First, both accounts begin with a specific angelic announcement. The news of the child comes directly from a divine messenger, rather than human observation. Second, both births occur in situations where life is biologically impossible. Samson's mother was barren, Mary was a virgin. In both cases, the natural path to life was closed. Third, both children are consecrated from the beginning. They are set apart with a specific mission that defines their entire existence before they are even born. And finally, both are sent to initiate the rescue of their people from a state of ongoing oppression. These 4 points of contact are not incidental. They establish a deliberate connection between the two figures. By emphasizing that these lives began where human biology ended, the text demonstrates that the rescue of the people cannot be manufactured by human effort. It must be an act of divine initiative. These parallels suggest that the story of Samson shows us that when human capability is exhausted, a different kind of intervention is required. In theological study, this relationship is called typology. This diagram represents how typology works. A historical person, in this case Samson, acts as a prototype. He is a shadow that provides the outline for a future complete reality. But a prototype is limited. Samson is a flawed, often violent man. He represents the potential of the mission, but his character remains deeply imperfect. This perspective changes how we view the book of Judges. It is no longer just a record of tribal wars, but a text that points toward a larger resolution. Samson's life illustrates the need for a savior. His strength highlights the very problem that strength alone cannot solve. If the origins of Samson and Jesus are so similar, why did the era of Judges end in failure while the era of Jesus offered permanent change? The difference lies in the nature of the rescue. Samson possessed immense physical power and could defeat armies, but he eventually fell to his own internal human impulses. His strength could break pillars, but it couldn't break the cycle of his own nature. On this scale, we see the contrast. Samson provided a temporary physical victory. Jesus, by addressing the root causes of sin and death, offered a rescue that doesn't rely on physical strength or human consistency. Judges 13 reveals that even when a human leader is granted supernatural power, the human condition remains unchanged. Power alone does not result in a permanent fix. The people in the time of Judges wanted to be free from their enemies, but they lacked the internal will to remain faithful to God. The problem wasn't their lack of a strong man, it was their lack of a new nature.
This history allows us to see exactly why a human solution is insufficient. It clarifies the specific reasons why a different kind of savior was necessary. The record of Samson proves that humanity cannot save itself from its own cycle of failure. Our hope depends on God entering into our history to accomplish what is otherwise impossible.
We routinely hear the advice to trust our gut, but making critical life choices simply because they feel right in the moment frequently leads us straight into a trap of distraction. To understand how to avoid this, we are going to examine an ancient text. Specifically, we will look at a deep theological analysis of the biblical book of Judges, chapter 14. By unpacking the events of this chapter, we are going to build a 3-step divine alignment filter. The ultimate goal is to help you transition from a distracted follower to a highly focused one. Before we proceed, bring one specific pending life choice or a current distraction to the forefront of your mind. Hold it there to test against this framework as we build it. Applying this historical framework to your modern choices exposes the personal distractions that often disguise themselves as good opportunities. Step 1 is the preference test. We have to identify the true root source driving your desire. In Judges 14, the Israelite leader Samson makes a fatal flaw. Against clear warnings, he chooses to pursue a Philistine woman purely based on physical appeal. He justifies this decision with a single, dangerous metric: she was right in his eyes. This diagram illustrates the necessary correction. The switch flips our orientation away from the lust of our own eyes, represented by these scattered, shiny personal preferences, and aligns us with the Lord's eyes, targeting a single, straight upward path of spiritual mission. To pass step 1, you must actively interrogate your pending decision. You have to explicitly separate your immediate personal preference from your actual long-term calling. Failing to cross-examine our preferences turns our own vision into our greatest vulnerability. Step 2 is the sovereignty check. Here, we analyze the broader, hidden architecture of your situation. This is especially vital if you have already made a messy choice. Look at this visualization. It demonstrates how God's absolute sovereignty operates even within human rebellion. An unseen force pulls the mess together, using Samson's flawed marriage to strike back at enemies. As this golden rope expands into a tight safety net, it offers comfort. God's ability to orchestrate his will behind the scenes brings utility even to our past mistakes. Samson was a Nazirite, bound by a sacred vow to remain separate from death. When he reached into that lion's carcass to grab the honey, he chose a momentary snack over his entire spiritual identity. While God may use our wreckage to achieve his goals, this shows that the wreckage itself remains a violation of our purpose, rather than a sanctioned path. True divine sovereignty is a safety net that catches human weakness. It is not a license to continue making compromised decisions. Step 3 is crisis turnaround and focus calibration. This is where we redefine obstacles as future fuel and actively block out minor, ego-driven distractions. Watch this simulation of the central metaphor. Samson tears apart a roaring lion with his bare hands, discovering honey inside its carcass. God takes a lethal attack and transforms it into sweet provision. Yet, in the immediate aftermath of this incredible victory, Samson loses his focus. Instead of executing his primary mission, he gets sidetracked playing petty riddle games with his enemies. To understand true focus, we contrast Samson, the distracted savior, with Christ, the perfect savior. Christ confronted the roaring lion of the enemy and never deviated from his ultimate mission. Look at your current situation and hunt for the riddles. Identify the distractions that feel productive or clever right now, but actually pull you away from your core calling. Surviving the crisis is only half the battle. The ultimate success is found in maintaining strict directional focus once the immediate threat is gone. Let's bring that specific decision back to mind and view it through the complete Judges 14 filter. This graphic shows the toggle switch, the woven rope, and the honeycomb sliding together to form a glowing shield. You now have 3 secured capabilities: spotting visual lust, recognizing overriding sovereignty, and ignoring shiny distractions.
Processing your daily choices through this filter forces a shift in perspective. It moves your decision-making from reactive impulses to a deliberate practice of staying separate from the world's distractions. Your daily directive is straightforward. Whenever you catch yourself justifying a choice by saying, "I just like it," halt. Remember the Samson trap. Following this exact alignment ensures you stop operating as a chaotic tool of God and start walking purposefully as a clear, focused follower.
When we think of Samson, we usually see a comic book hero, a man of impossible explosive strength who appears completely invincible as he tears through the ranks of his enemies. But Judges chapter 15 reveals a different picture. Samson's physical power is undeniable, yet his story is defined by a deep and growing isolation. At this point in the narrative, the Philistine occupation of Israel has become the status quo. The tragedy isn't just the enemy's oppression, it is the spiritual apathy that has settled over the people of God. This apathy turns into active betrayal. 3,000 men of Judah, Samson's own kin, mobilize a small army. They aren't looking for a fight with the Philistines, they are looking to arrest their own savior. They tell Samson, "Do you not know the Philistines are rulers over us?" It is a moment of profound cowardice. They have become so afraid of their masters that they would rather remain in chains than risk the upheaval of being rescued. Samson's resulting solitude isn't an accident of history. His abandonment by his own people mirrors the path Jesus would take, rejected by the very ones he came to deliver, facing his mission entirely alone. Samson chooses not to fight his brothers. He stands still and allows the men of Judah to bind his wrists with new ropes, quietly permitting them to hand him over to the enemy. This is the essence of typology. It is how physical events in the Old Testament function as a vocabulary for the life of Jesus, where a historical moment of binding serves as a precursor to a greater spiritual reality. The visual of Samson, bound and surrendered by his own tribe, points directly to Jesus. Both men were tied up by their own religious and ethnic leaders and handed over to a hostile pagan empire. In both accounts, the motivation was the same. The community wanted to preserve their fragile peace. They calculated that it was safer to sacrifice the deliverer than to challenge the authorities. By entering their greatest trials completely rejected by their communities, both Samson and Christ show that the weight of deliverance is a burden the hero must carry without help. When the Philistines see Samson bound, they shout in triumph. But the Spirit of God rushes upon him, and the ropes burst off his arms as if they were burnt thread. Using nothing but the fresh jawbone of a donkey, Samson single-handedly cuts through 1,000 soldiers. It is a scene of raw, solitary violence. This physical battle at Lehi serves as a shadow of Christ's spiritual victory. While Samson fought an army of men, Jesus, in his final hours, stood alone against the powers of sin and death. There were no supporting legions for either figure. They each had to absorb the full, concentrated pressure of the enemy's hostility without a single follower standing by them. These moments illustrate that the power of God often becomes most visible when every human resource and every scrap of communal support has been stripped away. But the victory of the jawbone is only half the story. The high of the battle is immediately met with a devastating reminder of what it means to be human. The adrenaline of the fight vanishes, and Samson collapses. He is miles from any source of water, dying of a thirst so severe it threatens to finish what the Philistines could not. Here is the paradox. The man who just killed 1,000 soldiers is now helpless against his own biology. His strength, however great, is not self-sustaining. He cries out to God, and a spring of water erupts from a hollow place in the ground. Samson drinks, his spirit is revived, and he names the water En-Hakkore, the spring of the collar. This connects us back to the cross. Jesus, after securing a spiritual victory that would change the world, also voiced his physical limit, crying out, "I thirst." It is easy to focus on the jawbone, the moments of strength and public success, but the spring at En-Hakkore reminds us that even our greatest triumphs are hollow if we are not connected to the source of life.
The final takeaway isn't found in the power of the hero, but in his dependency. We survive not by our own might, but by the constant, life-giving provision that only comes when we call out to God.
"3,000 people are crushed under thousands of tons of stone. The massive pillars supporting the Temple of Dagon are cracking, giving way, and bringing the entire structure down in a catastrophic cloud of dust. And the man who pulled those pillars down dies right alongside his enemies. That violent end belongs to Samson. He is a man infamous for breaking his vows, yielding to his worst impulses, and destroying his own life. Yet, against all logical expectations, he is remembered today as a spiritual hero. A recent deep dive Bible study into Judges chapter 16 brings this exact tension to the surface. It challenges everything we think we know about his story, forcing us to reevaluate his legacy. To accurately understand Samson, we have to stop analyzing his superhuman physical strength. Instead, we have to confront a massive theological contradiction regarding his eternal salvation. The contradiction starts in the book of Hebrews, specifically chapter 11. Theologians universally recognize this chapter as the Bible's ultimate hall of faith. This timeline maps out the undisputed heavyweights of biblical history. You have foundational figures like Abraham, Moses, and David, individuals whose trust shaped human events. But then the lineage rapidly expands, and we find an anomaly. Samson is officially inserted alongside these giants. The Bible study raises a sharp point here. We spend so much time analyzing Samson's weaknesses, pointing fingers at his obvious, catastrophic sins. We completely miss the more important question: how did a man who lost absolutely everything on earth still manage to secure his salvation? Finding his name in that specific list forces us to reconsider the rules of redemption and redefine what actually qualifies someone as righteous in the eyes of God. Before we look at his redemption, we have to look honestly at his failures. Samson offended both man and God. He ignored his sacred Nazirite vows, surrendered his holy secret to Delilah, and allowed his personal lusts to override his divine calling. We can visualize the immediate consequence of those choices right here. A perfectly structured, tranquil landscape is suddenly fractured by deep, jagged fissures. Samson completely destroyed his own earthly peace. The collapse of Samson's earthly peace serves as a precursor to a far more dangerous consequence. He had placed his eternal salvation in severe jeopardy. The study delivers a stark, timeless warning for us today. Giving in to worldly temptations doesn't happen in a vacuum. It rapidly erodes your spiritual foundations, leaving you entirely vulnerable. By the time his enemies gouged out his eyes and bound him in bronze chains, the damage was already done. His physical blindness and his literal imprisonment were merely the outward, visible results of his severe internal spiritual decay. This brings us to his absolute lowest point. Samson is trapped, humiliated, and grinding grain in a subterranean Philistine prison. A single stark beam of harsh light piercing through the dark is his only connection to the outside world. But right here, in the dark, the narrative turns. He speaks his final, desperate prayer, recorded in Judges 16:28. Look at this typography layout isolating the key translated words from that verse. He cries out, "Lord, God," and asks him to remember. He uses a formal structural acknowledgement of Jehovah. Samson's specific choice of words moves past a simple request for physical strength and signals a total resubmission to God's ultimate authority. This brief, desperate cry proves something vital. Even in his darkest, most humiliating moment of defeat, his underlying belief in God remained entirely intact. This brings us back to the core realization of our Bible study. Samson is absolutely not declared righteous because he lived a flawless life. The evidence clearly proves he didn't. Instead, he falls perfectly into the theological category of being declared righteous by faith. This visual logic equation maps out exactly how divine grace interacts with human failure. You have grace acting as the massive base layer, but it requires the variable of human faith to connect and output salvation. As you can see with this glowing thread, his faith was violently tested and stretched under extreme tension by his own terrible choices, but it held firm. It never snapped. Enduring faith requires an ultimate willingness to turn back to the Creator, regardless of the severity or the shame of prior failures. This is the actionable lesson. True faith is not defined by a perfect track record of avoiding every pitfall in life. No matter how far you have strayed or how completely your life has collapsed, refusing to let go of God and reaching out in final, enduring faith is the true foundation of eternal salvation.
We live in an era of buffet-style spirituality. People stroll down the religious aisle, picking out the comforting rituals and aesthetic traditions they like, while quietly leaving the demanding moral obligations on the shelf. But treating devotion like a customizable menu is not a modern habit. If we look at the archaeological layers of ancient history, specifically chapter 17 of the Book of Judges, we find a perfect mirror for our current behavior. To understand this period, you have to look at the power vacuum of the era. This was a chaotic stretch of time in Israel's history, set after the death of the early military leaders, but long before the establishment of a centralized monarchy under King Saul. Without a central authority to enforce the law, society fractured. The guiding philosophy of the age is summarized by a single line from the text. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. The collective moral compass of the nation shattered. This brings us to a specific historical case study, a man named Micah, living deep in the rugged hill country of Ephraim. Micah's story provides a vivid example of what happens when a society discards objective truth. Religious devotion doesn't disappear, it simply warps into a series of self-serving, arbitrary rituals designed to make the worshiper feel good. Micah's story begins with an act of domestic theft. He steals 1,100 shekels of silver from his own mother. He doesn't return the silver out of sudden moral conviction. When his mother discovers the money missing, she pronounces a harsh curse upon the thief. Overcome by sheer panic and superstition, Micah quickly confesses and hands the silver back. Terrified that her curse might now land on her own son, the mother desperately attempts a spiritual neutralization. She immediately declares that she is dedicating the returned silver to Yahweh. But the actual execution reveals a massive discrepancy. Look closely at this breakdown of the silver. The mother pledged 1,100 shekels, yet she only gives 200 shekels to the silversmith. Over 80% of her so-called devotion is quietly pocketed, and the remaining fraction of that silver is immediately used to commit another severe violation. The silversmith forges the 200 shekels into 2 physical idols, which Micah installs in his home to represent Yahweh. This directly disobeys the core of the Mosaic Law. The 10 Commandments explicitly forbid the creation of any graven images to represent the divine. Micah and his mother are attempting to worship God using the exact methods God explicitly banned. The drastic financial bait-and-switch, combined with the instant idol creation, strips away any illusion of piety. This family isn't acting out of a genuine reverence for the divine. They are simply engaging in supernatural fear management. Once the idols are forged, Micah's architectural ambitions grow. He constructs a private household shrine and manufactures his own ephod, a sacred garment strictly reserved for the high priest. To staff this new shrine, he improperly ordains his own son to act as his personal live-in priest. Soon after, a young wandering Levite passes through the hill country. Micah hires him on the spot, replacing his son and treating the young man as a spiritual father figure. Micah assumes this staffing upgrade adds a layer of official legitimacy to his operation. Looking at this ancestral tree, biblical law is absolute. Only direct descendants of Aaron hold authority to act as priests. Micah is an Ephraimite, and his new hire a Levite. Both represent invalid, disconnected branches trying to graft onto a closed system. Micah's rapid accumulation of shrines, idols, and unauthorized priests points to a deep psychological misunderstanding. He treats God entirely like a cosmic vending machine. a force that can be manipulated if the right buttons are pushed. He actually believes that by caging an Israelite Levite inside a room with pagan idols, he has successfully trapped the divine presence. He assumes this combination guarantees a blessing on his household. He is entirely wrong. Mixing pagan idolatry with stolen elements of Israelite tradition does not yield a clever hybrid faith. It generates total, blasphemous illegitimacy. The most staggering aspect of Micah's story is his complete lack of self-awareness. He committed theft, practiced idolatry, and fabricated a false priesthood, yet he felt utterly righteous and fully expected a divine reward. This ancient disconnect translates seamlessly to modern behavior. Today, individuals frequently prioritize whatever practices bring them psychological peace over the actual, demanding obedience required by God. Approaching the divine on our own terms is a dangerous game. When we use secular habits or self-invented methods to construct our spiritual lives, we strip away the authority of the entity we claim to serve. Authentic worship has a non-negotiable standard. It must be strictly governed by established biblical principles and original scriptural truth, completely free from our personal alterations. True devotion requires absolute submission to that established truth. If we remove the rules we dislike and keep only what comforts us, we are no longer worshiping God. We are only bowing to a reflection of our own desires.
The Book of Judges describes a period in ancient Israel defined by political breakdown and social instability. Without a central government, different tribes and factions were left to navigate a landscape shaped by whoever held the most influence. During this time, the tribe of Dan was struggling. They were unable to secure the southern coastal territory originally assigned to them, and under pressure from the Amorites, they decided to abandon their designated home to look for territory elsewhere. To find a new home, the tribe sent 5 elite scouts on a journey to the far north. This map shows their route as they traveled nearly 100 miles, searching for a location that would be easier to capture than the fortified coastal plains of the south. The scouts eventually discovered Laish. It was a quiet, agricultural settlement located in a fertile valley, notably far from any major cities or allies who could come to its defense. Archaeological remains from this era, like these low-stacked stone foundations, reveal the vulnerability of places like Laish. These settlements lacked the massive walls and defensive towers found in larger regional powers, making them highly susceptible to a sudden arrival of armed forces. By walking away from their assigned borders to find a softer target, the Danites moved outside of the tribal community and the original plan for their inheritance. This geographic shift left them isolated, creating the conditions for the tribe to eventually abandon their traditional laws. Following the scouts' report, 600 Danite warriors mobilized for war. They began a long, tactical march toward the north, moving as a disciplined military unit with a specific destination in mind. Along the way, the army detoured into the hill country of Ephraim. They stopped specifically at the home of a man named Micah, who had established his own private sanctuary. While the soldiers guarded the entrance, the 5 scouts entered Micah's house and seized his silver idols. This wasn't a random theft. They were intentionally collecting the physical components they needed to establish their own religious center. The schematic shows the 2 assets the Danites extracted from the house, the idols and Micah's personal priest. This priest was a descendant of Moses, and he agreed to join the Danites when they offered him a higher-ranking position serving the entire tribe. Stealing a priest and sacred objects marked a transition for the Danites. They were no longer just a displaced military force. They were now a tribe traveling with their own self-appointed religious leadership and stolen icons. When Micah discovered his emptied sanctuary, he gathered neighbors and chased the Danites. This visualization shows the scale of the confrontation. Micah's small group stood no chance against 600 trained warriors. The Danites responded to Micah's protest with a direct threat. They warned him that if he continued to follow them, some of the soldiers would lose their tempers and kill him and his family. Micah looked at the soldiers, realized he was outnumbered, and turned back toward his home. He had no legal or military recourse to get his property back. This encounter demonstrated that the Danite tribe was now operating purely on the basis of military power. They had moved away from the ethical laws of the covenant,
replacing them with a system where whoever had the most weapons decided what was right. The Danite army eventually reached the northern valley and surrounded the city of Laish. The inhabitants, who had lived in peace and security, were unprepared for a military siege. The Danite forces moved through the city without resistance, killing the inhabitants and burning the settlement to the ground. Within a short time, the peaceful town was destroyed. After the fire, the Danites rebuilt the city on the same site. They claimed it as their own and renamed the new settlement Dan after their tribal ancestor. To make the city their own, they installed the silver idols they had stolen from Micah. This mud brick archway at the site reflects the permanent nature of the new city, a place that was now a fortified center for their own tribal religion. They formalized this system by making the priesthood a hereditary position within one family, specifically the descendants of Jonathan, the grandson of Moses. This created a religious hierarchy that operated independently of the laws given to the rest of Israel. This map shows the resulting religious divide. While the true house of God remained at Shiloh in the south, the city of Dan became a competing sanctuary in the far north, housing a different set of idols and a different priesthood. This move north began as a search for an easier life, but ended in the establishment of a religious system that would influence the region for centuries. The decision to abandon their intended borders eventually contributed to a spiritual decline that lasted until the tribe was finally taken into captivity.
Modern culture celebrates autonomy. We're told the highest virtue is living our own truth, answering to no one, acting as sovereign rulers of our lives. But an ancient text offers a terrifying counter-narrative to that ideal. The 19th chapter of the Book of Judges acts as a dark mirror, showing the outcome of an entire society actually achieving absolute self-rule. This is the cascade effect. When a society lacks a shared moral authority, the resulting failures move through every layer of the community, starting at the family level and moving outward to the national government. We tend to think our private compromises are contained, that what we do behind closed doors is victimless and remains isolated to us. The reality is much sharper. When a culture rejects a supreme king to simply do what is right in its own eyes, private, hidden sins become the direct catalysts for public ruin. This map traces a journey through ancient Israel. The route starts in the hill country of Ephraim. Following this path is a Levite, a spiritual leader who compromised his calling by taking a concubine. Their journey eventually crosses into the city of Gibeah. In ancient Near Eastern culture, hospitality was a strict, non-negotiable duty. Yet as night falls in Gibeah, not a single local citizen offers them shelter. The entire community has abandoned baseline cultural morality. An elderly foreigner finally takes them in, but the situation escalates rapidly. A local mob surrounds the house. They pound on the doors, demanding the host hand over the Levite so they can sexually assault him. Faced with the mob, the spiritual leader makes his choice. In a raw act of cowardice and self-preservation, the Levite pushes his own concubine outside to the mob and slams the door shut behind her. When the very man tasked with spiritual leadership and protection abandons his duty to save himself, the last line of defense for the vulnerable vanishes. His compromise leaves the weak at the mercy of the mob. When dawn breaks, the Levite opens the door to resume his journey. He finds the woman collapsed on the threshold, dead from the abuse she suffered through the night. Instead of appealing to God or a legal court, the Levite dismembers her body, fracturing it into 12 pieces. He sends one piece to each tribe. The message spreads outward from Gibeah across the tribal network, a morbid call to arms. The delivery triggers massive mobilization. The 11 tribes gather armies and march on Benjamin, demanding they surrender the abusers. The Benjamites refuse. The resulting civil war is catastrophic. Tens of thousands die, and the tribe of Benjamin is nearly erased from the map. The Levite met a moral vacuum with eye for an eye vigilantism, but answering extreme violence with unrestrained revenge doesn't resurrect justice. It simply completes the destruction of the social fabric. Reading through this sequence, a critical theological question naturally surfaces. Where was God while all of this was happening? The text offers no divine intervention here, but God's intentional silence is a judgment in itself.
He steps back to reveal the pure ugliness of humanity when we are left entirely to our own devices. This chaos creates a historical longing. The text repeatedly notes that Israel had no king, highlighting a desperate need for a righteous leader to bring order out of tribal blood feuds. This longing for a king who rules with both justice and mercy is the historical bridge to the arrival of Jesus Christ. The story of Judges 19 shows precisely why humanity requires his leadership to escape the cycle of self-destruction, which brings the mirror back to us. Look at your own life. Identify the private areas, how you manage your time, how you treat relationships, or the habits you hide, where you are operating without a king. It is dangerous to rationalize these seemingly small deviations from God's design. The Levites' story started with a single selfish choice that eventually led to the decimation of an entire tribe and a cycle of internal slaughter. You interrupt this cycle by actively submitting your private governance to divine leadership. That means acknowledging his authority over the hidden things and choosing to be a deliberate light in your environment, rather than blending into the shadows. Judges 19 forces us to confront our own capacity for darkness, because it is only when we see the true cost of doing what is right in our own eyes that we will truly abandon self-rule and run toward the true king.
Long before Israel had a king, the social order had shattered. The Book of Judges describes an era defined by a terrifying premise. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Subjective morality was the law of the land. To understand the consequences of that vacuum, we are analyzing the tragic breakdown of a nation recorded in Judges chapters 19 through 21. The crisis begins with an act of extreme violence. In the town of Gibeah, a mob brutally attacks and kills a Levite's concubine in the middle of the night. Following the murder, the Levite took her body, divided it into 12 pieces, and sent a piece along each of these paths, out into the territories of the 12 tribes of Israel. This was a calculated shock tactic. By sending these grisly reminders to every corner of the land, the Levite created a nationwide provocation designed to bypass reason and trigger a collective, visceral outrage. When the Levite eventually testified before the National Assembly, he omitted his own cowardice. He hid the fact that he personally handed his concubine over to the mob to save himself, framing the event to center his own victimhood. Hearing this one-sided account, the other 11 tribes instantly united in a roaring fury. They didn't ask a single follow-up question or attempt to cross-examine his narrative. This imbalance illustrates the primary risk in conflict resolution. Avoiding bias requires cross-examining facts, not accepting a single narrative. Maintaining objectivity means withholding a verdict until every perspective is weighed. Finally, compassion serves as a safeguard, prioritizing restoration over a reflex to punish. Because the Israelites lacked these safeguards, they acted on incomplete information. Their response rapidly shifted from a pursuit of justice into an indiscriminate crusade. The opposing side was equally entrenched. The tribe of Benjamin chose tribal pride over the law, using their formidable military strength to shield the men of Gibeah from facing the consequences of their crime. On the other side of the battlefield, the 11 tribes assumed that because they were fighting against a horrific act, their own conduct was beyond reproach. They saw themselves as the sole arbiters of justice. This reveals how self-righteousness functions. When a group is fueled by raw emotion and fleshly anger, they risk committing acts that mirror the very evil they set out to punish. While the Israelites moved as one, this militaristic alliance was not biblical unity. True unity is designed to build the gospel and restore brethren, not to facilitate the destruction of an entire tribe. When a group finds its common ground in shared hatred rather than shared love, they create a false unity, one that does not carry the blessing of God. They eventually sought divine guidance, but only to confirm the decisions they had already made. They didn't ask if they should go to war, but only who should lead the first wave. This is a prayer of presumption. It treats God as a rubber stamp for human plans, rather than a sovereign authority to be consulted. The consequences were catastrophic. Despite their massive numerical advantage, the 11 tribes suffered 2 humiliating defeats, losing 40,000 men in the process.
This scale of loss forces a critical pause for self-reflection. It suggests that before confronting the sins of others, one must first identify the hidden anger or pride within their own ranks. Without that introspection, it is impossible to know if an action is a genuine desire for restoration or simply a crusade fueled by one's own sin. Broken by their losses, the Israelites finally changed their approach. On their third attempt to seek God, they came with weeping and fasting. Fasting and weeping serve a specific purpose here. These acts strip away human pride and military confidence, signaling a total reliance on God's sovereignty. They followed this with burnt and fellowship sacrifices. This was a public confession of their own spiritual failures, acknowledging their own need for atonement before addressing the faults of Benjamin. Finally, they posed an open-ended question: should we go up? This time, they were prepared to accept no as an answer. Victory was only promised once the people shifted from demanding validation to submitting in total humility. The 11 tribes eventually achieved a victory, but it was a grim one. By the end of the conflict, the tribe of Benjamin had been nearly annihilated. In the aftermath, the survivors realized their self-righteous anger had permanently scarred the nation. They had won, but they stood in a landscape of ashes. Avoiding such devastation requires a departure from tribal rage, shifting instead toward the structured, restorative principles Jesus later outlined in Matthew 18. These two paths lead to entirely different ends. Love and humble prayer are designed to restore a community, while human rage and self-righteousness are designed only to destroy it. The next time you face a conflict, put down the sword of self-righteousness. Seek the whole truth before taking a single step forward.
When a society loses its ultimate moral authority, the system eventually begins to consume itself in the name of restoring order. This Bible reading sharing examines chapter 21 of the book of Judges. This ancient text recorded here provides a stark blueprint for understanding the mechanics of social and moral breakdown. The chapter opens in the immediate aftermath of a devastating civil war. The Israelite coalition has emerged victorious against one of their own, but the nation remains fractured by the recent violence. This chart illustrates the scale of the resulting demographic crisis. While 11 tribes retain their populations, the tribe of Benjamin has been nearly eradicated. Only 600 men remain, pushing an entire branch of the nation toward extinction. Beyond the physical destruction of the war, a vacuum of leadership emerges. The surviving tribes realize a foundational piece of their identity is about to disappear forever, and they have no clear mechanism to stop it. They face an unyielding religious roadblock. Before the war ended, the victorious Israelites swore a binding oath to God. They would never allow their daughters to marry the men of Benjamin. This creates systemic paralysis. The national leaders are trapped between honoring a rigid legal vow and watching one of their original 12 tribes biologically vanish. Without a central king or a unifying moral arbiter, there is no authority figure capable of pardoning the oath or mediating a legitimate compromise. When an institution lacks a true moral compass, its leaders often pivot to dangerous, pragmatic workarounds just to patch the very bureaucratic disasters they created. To fix their demographic problem, the elders search for a loophole. They scan the nation for any group that failed to attend the original wartime assembly, and therefore never personally swore the marriage ban. They find their target on the map, the isolated city of Jabesh-Gilead. Because of its distance, the residents of this region were not present when the oath was taken. The government's solution is clinical. The Israelite assembly deploys an army to slaughter the city's inhabitants, specifically sparing only 400 virgin women to be extracted and given to the Benjaminites. The leaders never frame this massacre as a crime. In their minds, it is a necessary administrative procedure required to save the nation's structural integrity. This is the hallmark of systemic injustice. An ungoverned authority will often punish innocent people as collateral damage, provided it mathematically resolves a past failure of leadership. Even after the violence at Jabesh-Gilead,
the math still fails. The elders remain 200 women short of providing a wife for every surviving Benjaminite. They devise a second scheme centering on an upcoming religious festival in the city of Shiloh, grounded here in these ancient stone foundations. The elders instruct the remaining 200 Benjaminite men to hide in the vineyards around Shiloh. When the young women come out to dance for the festival, the men are told to ambush the celebration and kidnap a wife. Looking at this legal flowchart, we see the elders' logic. The original oath stated they could not give their daughters away. By ensuring the women are forcibly stolen, the fathers technically bypass the wording of the vow. This rationalization demonstrates the exact moment a society's morality is replaced by pure legal compliance. Institutional corruption is visible in the way authorities use clever legal definitions to sponsor kidnapping and violence, actively framing the abuse as practical problem-solving. The immediate crisis is technically solved. The tribe of Benjamin survives and will rebuild its population, but the moral soul of the Israelite nation has collapsed. This brings us to the final verse of the book of Judges, which anchors this entire study. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. The phrase "no king" describes the disillusion of objective, unifying truth. Without a shared moral center, the rule of law is replaced by individual or tribal preference. The most terrifying actions in an ungoverned society are rarely born from cartoonish malice. They stem from a desperate, unchecked desire by the authorities to do what seems right in their own eyes. The patterns of ancient Israel find echoes in the modern geopolitical landscape. When international frameworks lack a central moral authority or the power to enforce it, sovereign states often revert to the same survivalist logic seen in the book of Judges. Like the Israelite elders, modern nations often prioritize pragmatic loopholes, redefining boundaries or using technicalities to justify the displacement of populations and the use of unprovoked force. Whether thousands of years ago or today, human nature without a governing moral heart will always rationalize its own